Motivation and inspiration are powerful tools that change and influence perspectives, voices, and projects that shape the world. With all the negativity in the world, it can be hard to find those rare and beautiful stories that tell of inspired spiritual activism and individual healing journeys. Walk the path with me, Dr. Trish DeRocher, on the show Heart, Change, Consciousness, where we inspire listeners to take action towards a more just world. We'll hear from authors, change makers, influencers, activists, poets, filmmakers, and cultural workers who practice inspired spiritual activism and transform vulnerabilities into sources of strength. Heart Change Consciousness allows us to understand the world from different perspectives and highlights what is possible when we are fearless and open ourselves to our soul purpose and engage each other across boundaries. So let's self-heal and open the path to self-sovereignty. Heart Change Consciousness begins now.
Wow, what a great show. Dr. Trish DeRocher is joining me here today. This is her show. And the topic for today, for all of you, and I want to welcome all of you to this, because when we're thinking about consciousness, are we thinking about transformative consciousness? But as we think about it, and we've gone through, since I've been doing the show, many, many iterations of what things mean. But when a certain author came out with a certain book, he literally changed the landscape of accountability. And he came out with a statement that boiled down to 4 agreements. Thank you, Don Miguel, for creating agreements that most people cannot do. There's not a single person that I know that have read your book that know how to do all 4 in life every day. And the one we get hung up on is accountability and what it means to be an accountability culture. And that's what Dr. Trish DeRocher is taking on today. But more importantly, it's more than a conversation for her. If you've listened to her shows, if you're working with her, then you know that this is a life path and a purpose. But what is it that we have not yet come to learn about transformative consciousness and accountability? Dr. Trish, this is a big, big topic, right? It's one of those words that, at least in my journey in the academic world, it's one of those words when you go or attempt to study it, 1,000 people will have 1,000 different.
Absolutely.
But for you, this is really taking the world of social justice and spirituality and having a bigger conversation about it, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Boy, you do take on these big conversations. I get so intrigued every show that I look at and prepare for with you. It's like, basically, that's all I have to say. The rest is all you.
Somebody has to have these conversations, right? To just bring it into the collective. I don't know. It's my Aries. It's my fire. We go there.
Oh, my God. Yeah, and, let me say this about your Aries and your fire. I'm a Sagittarian and I have fire. But I will tell you that I do not have that Aries fire, because the conversation is one that it's more than just an idea or a level of awareness. And I love the way you approach this. And what we're about to talk about today is because this is a time for not just transformative change, but almost of the superhero nature, almost of something that we have not tapped into before, that's yearning for us to bring forth. And we don't have to have all the answers, or maybe we do we?
No, I think we just need to show up in our hearts, right? And trust that as we do that, well, the answers will kind of come in to each of us in our own way. Yeah.
So let's start out the conversation about the word justice. I did a study way back, and I refused to follow the traditional theoretical perspective on trust and on accountability. And I created something that they call in studies a moderator. And when I picked the moderator that I picked, you should see the eyes roll. But what is it that people like you and me know about social justice? And why is it such a topic that turns more eyes, literally has the hair on people's chest stand up even if they don't have hair on their chest? But why is it that we cannot blend what you're going to talk about now today, social justice and spirituality? Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget the scolding I got for abbreviating social justice as SJ in an academic paper, but I'm turning the rest over to you.
Yeah, well, I think just to kind of give a little bit of history, my grandfather was a Supreme Court justice for the state of New York. My uncles are lawyers. And when I was younger, I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to, I wanted justice in the world. This has always been a deeply embedded thing for me. And talking to my grandfather, he just looked at me one day. He sat me down and he said, there is no justice in the justice system. Right. And back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, he started actually cataloging just kind of rogue and bogus charges against people. And he just had a running log. And, he kind of asked me before he passed to kind of carry the torch, but not in the way that I thought that I would. So I think that there is this form of juridical and punitive justice, right, which is kind of the dominant mode of justice in the U.S. at this time, where, there's someone is accused of doing something, right, and we know that by and large, BIPOC folks are incarcerated at much higher rates in this country. Michelle Alexander has a great book called The New Jim Crow. Yeah, that kind of documents all of this. But there's a way in which people aren't just, we don't think about the larger context or culture of why people are maybe led to do the things that they do, or looking at things structurally. We tend to just look at action, and then we criminalize a person, right, for an offense that may or may not have actually happened, right, without looking at all the other details. So social justice, right, is really instead focused on this transformative justice model where we are looking at structures of inequity through economics, the political system, the social system, and we're just looking at how these structures kind of maintain the status quo. So social justice then is really looking at leveling the playing field and not just looking at individual people's actions, right? But like, what's the infrastructure that we have that's actually working hard at maintaining the status quo and not allowing true equity to come into our social spheres for all people. And so when we're talking about this can be like in terms of education, healthcare, housing, employment, and also just the ways in which our society grants some people unearned privileges, right? And actually denies these privileges to other people based upon race, class, gender, sexuality, geopolitical location, education, ability, right? The list kind of goes on and on. So I'm really interested, and I grew up in an Irish Catholic household, and I also had the gift of my second family, who my best friend from childhood, her father actually studied with Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru. He's from Peru, and liberation theology in Peru is really wedding social justice and religion, right? And thinking, okay, how is it, and this is a Christian perspective or paradigm, but how is it that we actually allow the church to do what it says it's supposed to do, right? Which is to stand with the poor, stand with the oppressed. Yeah. So from a very young age, I had these two very different paradigms of the Catholic school that I kind of went to that very much upheld the status quo and these dominant structures, and then I also got this lens into this other way of really what faith and spirituality can look like when applied to this material plane, right, and to social systems. So I think that there's actually a really long spiritual tradition of combining social justice and spirituality, right? We can look at Black liberation theology, so people like Dr. King or Cornel West, and then, not just Gustavo Gutierrez, but all of the collective people's movements in South America that were really focused on liberation, right?
Oh, there's no question about it. And we don't really talk about that enough. But certainly for me, I've got more familiar with it since I found out, thank you, Ancestry and Internet, that my grandfather was born in Brazil and the history of his family in Brazil. And I started to look at this. But don't we know people, right? I mean, you can think of people, and let me just bring this up. I'm sure this is not what you meant, but let me just as you're speaking, here's what comes to mind. As a kid, I was fascinated with Joan of Arc. Mm-hmm. I was so fascinated with this person. I didn't know it was real. I didn't know Joan of Arc was like a real person, because if you're a young kid and you're interested in something like that, and somehow you pick up information and then you read about it, it almost seems like I'm reading a comic book. Mm-hmm. But in today's world, when we think about this, my sense is we can probably point to more people than ever that are building that bridge. What do you think?
I do think so. Absolutely. And I think that it's there, right? I think it has to do with where we're looking, right? Because certainly if we're only turning into the news, right, or mainstream news outlets, there's so much focus on what is wrong, right? That there's not actually a lens into what people are actually doing in this world to create these bridges. I also think that there is a very secular strand of social justice work, and that's really kind of where I see my intervention. M. Jackie Alexander, she's a Afro-Trinidadian transnational feminist theorist. She actually left academia a few years ago to start a spiritual center in Trinidad. She's one of my academic and spiritual heroes. She said in her book, Pedagogies of Crossing, that often social justice is people are coming from a posture of the hatred of existing systems instead of a love of justice, right? And I think in particular, if we're taking a very secular stance, it's easy to get lost in hopelessness, right? Of just like, this is all that there is, right? It's oppressing everyone without that bridge into, okay, so what else, right? What is this kind of contrast showing us about where we want to go? And that's, I think, where Cornel West, justice is what love looks like in public. Oh my God, that's so beautiful, right? How do we keep that focus on love? And I think that's where the term, right, when you were talking about shortening, social justice warrior, right, or SJW, like, it's become really a pejorative term, right?
Yeah.
Like, kind of in the dominant culture, people will just use it as shorthand of like, oh, they're always like posting on social media, or oh, they're always taking up these issues. And sure, right, there are strands, right, in social justice work that are ego based, right? That are focused on just kind of being, like the right kind of ally or being a good person. And it's not really focused on the work itself. Or, the people who are kind of talking the talk and not walking the walk. But I also think that it's a form of egoism to critique so harshly, because everybody needs an entry point into this work. And I think there's just so much judgment on all around that I think really imbuing this work with that spiritual dimension of understanding that people are showing up as they are when they're ready, And that sometimes it's the judgment inside these spaces that actually keep people blocked out
there, because, I finally did get the acronym included in my final paper. But here's the thing. You wake up one day, like today, and I know I'm doing this show with you, and all of a sudden I get an alert beep on my phone. And the alert beep on my phone, and why do I get these alert beeps on my phone? Because this has to do with accountability next. That's what we're going to talk about. And by the way, if you don't mind, let's just skip the break and keep rolling.
Yep.
Accountability as love. Okay. So I love the idea of what you talked about. Am I taking this position because I hate the structure, or is it because I love these people, and I don't see a level of, and how dare I use the word fairness in this discussion? This morning I wake up and Mississippi, I think it's Mississippi, has now put legislature in to banning transgender athletes. And so I wake up this morning and I want to hear the argument. Like, I want to hear the case. I want to hear, how did you get there? How did you get to that place? But yet, in my heart, I'm thinking, there is no argument. This is just, we ain't having them people in any sports down here. Yeah. And that is a form of prejudice, in my opinion, that is picking up momentum. Yes. And so I don't see anyone taking it on. And so sometimes if you take a thing on, you're looked at as, there she goes again. She's got that. I'm not even going to use the word, like, if you're a woman and you take something on, you know what we're called. But what if we move to hold a body of government accountable from a deep, deep place of compassion? What if we could do that? And let me ask you this. Aren't some of the people we're seeing now doing that already?
Yes. I think even inside the federal and state government, right, there are people who it's not, historically, the government has denied them, right, the right to be in these spaces of power. And it's also not easy for them to be in these spaces, right? So many of women of color have been voted in and are choosing this path very consciously, even though it takes so much emotional labor every single day for them to do this work. And I think obviously Dr. King was not a perfect person. None of us are perfect people. But I think that sometimes it's interesting, right? Because in dominant culture, he kind of gets whitewashed, right? Like, oh, he was just, like all soft and nonviolence and kind of no teeth. And so we forget that he was killed for a reason. We forget that, he was preaching about a very fierce love. And I think that we forget that love can be fierce, right? Like, we have this understanding that love needs to be soft and understanding all the time. But I think that there is fire in love, right? And to actually hold people and the collective accountable to growing into the truest, most authentic version of themselves, right? And there's, I think about it as like holding the soul blueprint, right, for both individuals and the collective. And I think this is what's different from like cancel culture, where someone says something quote unquote wrong and they're kind of written off as being toxic, right? Like that to me is very full of ego and resentment and hate. But accountability for me is something very, very different, right? So if I am in a space or I say something or do something where even if I feel like I have the clearest of intentions, if that impact, right, of what I say or do harms someone else, and that person trusts me enough to communicate that to me, right? That is an act of love on their part, right? And trust to communicate that. And it's also an act of love for me to be able to receive it without being defensive. So I think when you're saying, people rolling their eyes when talk of social justice comes up, that's a defense mechanism, right? there is this like very embodied, as we've talked about before on this show, reaction to, oh my gosh, I'm really scared, right? I'm going to be found out that I'm a bad person. Like I'm not going to go know what to do. I'm going to be told that like I can't, keep my way of life as I know it or my worldview. And so defensiveness, deflection, fight, freeze, like all of these things, or even like the fawning response of like, can't we all just get along and kind of erase those differences? They're all fear responses. So for me, social justice work is really rooted in a deep love for the collective and just a desire for everyone to be able to live easeful, love-filled lives, right? Without fearing for their life, without fearing of like, where are the material resources going to come from? And I think that a lot of the fear is, if you have lived a life of unearned privilege, right? Which means that you can walk down the street without having to think about your safety. You don't have to think about where your next meal is coming from, or if you're going to be discriminated against for driving your car, or, signing a lease or a mortgage. Right? Then when someone actually brings that to your attention, that can feel very, very scary to you, right? In your body. And there's just this fear around not knowing. We all have a fear around not knowing because it feels like we're out of control or we don't have control. Well,
I got to tell you, let me ask you about this because I don't want to blow by what you're saying. This is such a pivotal moment for that particular aspect of fear that I just want to talk about this and then we can move on, because I made a fuss months back, a year back, when I saw those kids in cages. Now, am I making a statement that's based on hate, or do I hate the system? No. No, it was like, we're humans. We don't do that to each other. That's the fantasy world I live in a lot of times. I am called Pollyanna Patty for a reason. But to see it and the tears, and then I get angry. So what am I angry about? You don't see them anymore. You don't know where the kids are. Trust me, they're still in cages. You don't see them anymore. You try to find out. Nobody's talking about them. And the more you talk about them on air, the more hate emails you get. And this idea of accountability and moving to the place where it's not scary, that has got to be our priority moving forward now. I have never seen so many people, Dr. Trish, afraid to put political stickers on their car, like for a candidate. Yeah. And I'm not saying which one. It doesn't matter. Right? But afraid of that. Afraid of standing in a voting line or standing and supporting somebody. Or right here in Seattle now, my friends are protesting about what's going on with the homeless, and they're afraid to do that. I've never seen that. Can you answer the question? What if accountability wasn't scary? Because I got to tell you, when I was walking and marching, my mama was down in Alabama. Everybody's marching. I think I was marching before I had my first job. I wasn't afraid.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that movement? That is one of the most important things that you are taking on. And I want to hear you direct us.
Yeah, I think that right now there's, I think everybody knows that there's just deep polarization, right? And often, right, if we're thinking about spirituality as like the movement out of duality, right? So when you're talking about the outrage, right, at the injustice of children being held in cages, that is just outrage, right? If we're taking a spiritual perspective and we understand that we're all individual expressions of the oneness of the collective, right? When someone else is being harmed, we are also being harmed, right? So I think one of the questions is, what is preventing us from seeing ourselves in each other, right? And from that very basic empathy of being able to look reality in the face, right? And regardless of what our defenses are, like, I think the thing is we can feel afraid. We can have all of these reactions in our bodies, and we can still also choose to be just. We can still also choose to be held accountable. And that choosing is both an act of love for ourselves, right? Growing ourselves, right? To be a more authentic, heart-based version of ourselves, but also for the collective, right? How do we grow ourselves into a heart-based society, right? We're thinking of shifting from head, ego mind is all about fear, down to the heart. And before we get into the accountability thing, I just want to say that it's fascinating to me that when I'm in like more academic or activist spaces, there can be a lot of like dismissal of anything connected to spirituality or the oneness at all, right?
Yeah.
And then talk about duality. Then I come over to my spiritual circles, and there's so much fear and resistance about talking about race or class, any kind of political division, which are also realities. So my focus is really like, how do we get these different polarities talking to each other without that fear? Like I've had clients who have been afraid to just speak on their political inclinations out of fear of judgment. And again, it's across the board, right? Or their, social identities don't fit with what their perceived political identities should be, right? And then they kind of close in. And this is very scary and concerning all around, because if we can't have these conversations and we can't meet each other in love, how are we going to be able to grow our society into that vision that we want to see? But I also think that it's an interesting shift where I think sometimes activist and academic circles are so kind of focused in the lower chakras without that connection to intuition or heart. And then sometimes in the spiritual sector, it feels so good to live in those higher chakras that they don't want to think about like grounding in this material reality. Like we have to know where we are before we can get to where we want to go. Just like we don't want to just focus on where we are without thinking about, like what's possible or what's motivating us to bring in this other world. So I think that the truth of who we really are is love. It's only ever love, right? And we get all sorts of noise in the signal. We get, our intergenerational trauma, inherited biases, our limiting worldviews based on where we grew up, what we saw, what we come to understand, like from our parents, our friends, our neighbors, our teachers, whatever we're learning, if we grew up religious in the church. But those hardened wounds, right? They turn into hatred and resentment. And when we're younger, we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
Right? We don't know what we don't know. But when we become grown, when we become adults in the world, we are responsible for addressing those things, right? Each of us are accountable for how we're showing up in the collective, because that inner flows outer. So your question about what if being accountable didn't need to feel scary, right? I mean, that's my dream.
Yeah.
What if people can actually meet each other, right? When someone is asking you to take accountability and seeing this as an opportunity to grow. Wow, they trust me enough to come and talk to me about this thing. And then my kind of role in that pact is to meet them there with love. And when we can both meet each other there with love, however uncomfortable, whatever our bodies are doing, then we both are able to be transformed by that interaction. So there's this beautiful blog by Mia Mingus, and it's called Leaving Evidence. And I just wanted to read a short blurb.
Please do.
Yeah, so this is from her entry called Dreaming Accountability. What if accountability wasn't scary? It will never be easy or comfortable, but what if it wasn't scary? What if our own accountability wasn't something we ran from, but something that we ran towards and desired, appreciated, and held as sacred? What if we cherished opportunities to take accountability as precious opportunities to practice liberation? to practice love, to practice the kinds of people, elders to be, and souls we want to be, to practice that which we can only practice in real time. After all, we can only practice courage when we are afraid. We can only practice taking accountability when we have wronged or harmed or hurt. Like, this is a society that I want to live in, right? And just thinking of accountability as a practice of love and liberation that allows us to grow ourselves into the types of people and society that we want to live in, right? So the question, as you kind of asked, is like, so how do we begin, right? How do we begin?
And, you know, let's take a short break. And when we come back, let's talk about the beginning, because sometimes we have to start at the end to understand that the next step is a new beginning. Yes. And, you know, what do I mean by that? This morning, when I saw that headlines, I stopped to think, I want to understand this. That's after I got really annoyed. But then I stopped to say, I need to understand this more. When we come back, let's talk about accountability. And one of the things that I'd love to hear you share is sometimes when we're living out of this chakra, we don't allow ourselves to really feel what inside us is injustice. It's all good. No, children in cages is not good. How do we find out more about you, Trish? And then we'll take a short break. Dr. Trish DeRocha.
Yeah, so my practice is Transformative Consciousness Coaching and Consulting. My website is transformativeconsciousness.com. And there you'll find individual services. You'll find some more about just what informs my practice. And in the spring, I'm actually going to be running a few group programs on whiteness and just kind of whiteness 101, confronting whiteness from a spiritual perspective and really looking at how the seeds of injustice, right, are first and foremost in ourselves, and that we have to address this in order to address it in wider society.
When we come back, this is for me. When we come back, what happens when we take a look in the mirror? But wait, with the lens, through the lens of love. What happens when we take that look in the mirror and we realize that the us that we see is the end? What is the next step we take? I'm not going to answer that question. That's Dr. Trish DeRocha. Let's take a short break, everybody. We'll be right back.
Come alive, let us see.
Message Delivery by Lisa Ann. You can't make this stuff up. Tune in every first and third Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific on TransformationTalkRadio.com. Message Delivery is an inspirational show about the journey to enlightenment and spirituality. For more information or your own personal message delivery, visit angelmessages2u.com. That's Angel Messages, the number 2, the letter U.com.
Transition, simultaneously the most difficult and vital part of the human experience. Without change, how would we grow? Tune in to Grounding into Your Radiance with Stacey Barber every second and fourth Thursday at 9 a.m. Pacific on TransformationTalkRadio.com. Step into your truth and allow the light into your life. For more information about Stacey and her services, visit StaceyBarber.com. That's Stacey, S-T-A-C-I-E, Barber.com.
It's time to get your life back on Burn Bright Today with Jennifer Marcinelli. Tune in each month on TransformationTalkRadio.com. Learn to move from the darkness of burning out to the light of burning bright. Jennifer is redefining stress and the energetic causes of burnout, shining a light on process to get your life back. For more information about Jennifer and her work, visit burnbrighttoday.com.
Tune in to The Truth is Funny with Colette Steffen each Wednesday at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern on TransformationTalkRadio.com. This hit show will have you thinking outside the box and riding the wave of infinite potential. Join Colette on the Higher Self Network, inspiring listeners to shine their brilliance and ensure success while roaring with laughter as they recognize the humor of the giant cosmic joke. Visit thetruthisfunny.com.
Raising the vibrations through stimulating conversations while exploring the mysteries of Atlantis and Lemuria on Tales from the Merworld Radio with me, Amira Beth. Join us every second and fourth Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific on TransformationTalkRadio.com. Be ready to feel empowered and an active part of the changing Earth. For more information about me, visit amirabeth.com.
The Truth is Funny. Shift Happens with Colette Marie Steffen is excited to welcome Karen Benton as a monthly guest host. Tune in on the third Wednesday of each month at 8 a.m. Pacific Time to regain confidence and trust in your capacity to create change in your life, your health, your family, and your well-being. Karen Benton is a mother, nurse practitioner, certified body talk practitioner, Franklin Method instructor, and owner of Limitless Living LLC. For more information about Karen, visit KarenBenton.com.
It takes courage just to breathe and feel all of this life.
Benny, where'd you get that from?
These are actually from Trish and her people.
I know. That's why I wanted to ask you about that. I can't tell you how many songs in my 20s like that I listened to and I sat around a fire the day before a march. Just saying. Tell us about that song for a minute, Trish, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So the singer-songwriter is my friend Denise Casey. And it's really cool because all of the proceeds from this album, so the song is called Come Alive, is going to a BIPOC urban farm in Winooski, Vermont. And so actually, I met Denise. Denise is another white-bodied person, and we met at Radical Dharma Camp and at the Omega Institute, but we found out that we both lived in Burlington, Vermont, and so we were able to connect that way. And, you know, just really, I think that's actually a beautiful way of thinking about accountability. Even there's a piece on my website, Waking Up to Whiteness, and I wrote it during, you know, when all the protests were happening after George Floyd was murdered. And at that time, right, that was not a time to ask BIPOC people, you know, for help or what should I do, right? And so Denise helped me, Denise Casey, the writer of that song, Come Alive, helped me to kind of draft and ask questions. And so talk about accountability, right? To be able to bring forward either, you know, I'm a white-bodied person, so with another white-bodied person, talking about, you know, what am I missing, right? What are the conversations? What's the discomfort? You know, what am I not seeing? And then allowing that in, right, as a deeper form of accountability to each other, but also to the collective, to start building these networks where, as white-bodied folks, we can start to have these conversations, even as they're uncomfortable, just to be able to provide some checks and balances, and also to receive that feedback. So yeah, that's where that song is coming from. And you can find her album on Bandcamp, and it's called Come Alive.
Thank you for bringing that forward. You know, we were talking about, and I want to get right to this and really turn it over to you here. And Benny and Jacob, we're going to skip the next break. Being accountable to ourselves. Looking in the mirror one day. I mean, this is me looking in the mirror. That seems to be my thing. It's like not mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all. It's like looking in the mirror and saying, who the bleep are you? Because you become unrecognizable. And I've had 4 moments in my life like that. Yeah. And I don't know why a mirror, past life. But then when you ask that question, it is the end of something. Yeah. And you don't always know that next step. Tell us about the pathway that we can follow to make that heart-conscious, transformative shift and change.
Yeah, absolutely. So I quoted that Cornel West quote of how justice is what love looks like in public. But the second half of that quote is just like tenderness is what love feels like in private, right? So I think one of these questions is, or one of the answers to your question is, how do we start to treat ourselves with tenderness, right? Because when we are judging other people, when we are in a place of rushing to judgment rather than understanding first, right? That is a reflection of how we're meeting ourselves. So I truly believe that we are each other's mirrors, right? And that whatever we're kind of seeing in my coaching practice, we call it master teachers, right? Our master teachers are all around us. Donald Trump has been one of my biggest master teachers. How do I engage, right, with this human who wants to eradicate the rights, right, and lives of people who are really dear to me, right? How do I meet even that with love? How do I meet him in my heart space and wish him love, wish him healing? So, I think that it's human, right, to see an injustice and get angry, right? Otherwise, we'd be bypassing, right? We'd be in la la land and just not allowing ourselves to be human. We are human, right? We're in this 3D material plane. We're navigating ego mind and that fear all the time. And we have a choice, right, of after that initial reaction to be like, okay, do I want to stay in fear, right? Do I want to stay in anger and judgment? Or do I want to make a conscious, deliberate choice to shift into love? And I think that this kind of love is hard, right? It's hard to want to understand something that that is unjust before just judging it. And I think that that's also part of our duty to try to understand, right? So not just looking at the actions, right, of another person that are unjust, but really trying on from our hearts what is leading to those actions, right? What is the original wound? Is this a wound, from their family? Is this intergenerational trauma, right? What is actually allowing people or a culture or a country to show up in this way, repeatedly harming other people? And when we start doing that work, right, shifting from judgment to understanding and shifting from judgment to tenderness, we need to start by looking in ourselves, right? How do we respond, right, when someone acts unjustly towards us? And I think that often these deep wounds fester and they harden, and what is originally sadness and vulnerability turns into hatred and resentment. And if our family, right, has I like to joke, I come from I think there's like 9 redheaded women in my family, right? And so like proud Irish women, and I was taught from a very young age that like we have tempers, we have wicked tongues, and if something isn't right, we just kind of like go off. And I had to actually sit with that and be like, no, that's trauma, right? I can be in my heart and I can be fierce without putting someone else down, without dipping into hate or rage, right? I can look at everything, right? And then I want to go into myself and be like, wow, why is that pressing that button in you right now? What wound is that there? And then eventually coming to address whatever is going around me, not from a place of judgment or hate or resentment, but from a deep place of love. I want our society to be better, right? I want each person to grow into their soul blueprint and their inherited blueprint of love. So I think most of us have been betrayed on all sorts of levels, right? And so if we have been betrayed and we're angry about being betrayed, if we have hatred and resentment that we're too afraid to look at, or those emotions, right, in the pit of our bellies that it feels too scary to really go into, then that's kind of like what we pass on into our interactions. If we think about all of our interactions with other people as energetic exchanges, if we're treating ourselves with judgment and hatred and resentment, we're going to send that out into the world. So I think, it often gets grandfathered in, right? Like, oh, well, this is the way it's always been, right? Or, well, that's how my parents expected me to handle it. And so I do think that accountability, right, to the collective has to start with accountability to ourselves. Well, okay, just because I was kind of taught to try to be perfect, right? Or, that to achieve my worth through overachieving, it doesn't mean that's the only way. It doesn't mean I have to judge myself, right, when I'm not perfect. It means, how can I be more tender with myself in those spaces where I'm not showing up perfect? How can I love myself even then? How can I love those parts of myself that I'm not really proud of? Not to stay there, but again, to try to understand, where is this coming from? So I really believe that beginning an intentional practice of being tender with ourselves really allows us to become more tender with other people. And we can't really do that work in the collective until we're doing that deep work with ourselves. So I like to say to my clients, like, what would it mean to talk to yourself like someone who you love?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's wild.
It is. And let me just ask you this, because I want to make sure that people know this is a body of work that you do that to help people. Now, even me talking about what I did, I had a mentor. I had two incredible people. I had Sidonia Cahill, my spiritual mentor, vision quester, takes people out in the desert, and Dr. Sherilyn Granrose, academic. And I had these two people at a pivotal point in time in my life, the look in the mirror moments. I do not think that I would have been able to move ahead or even understood what I was moving ahead to do without that help. This particular area is so important in our personal evolution to be able to move to this place that you're talking about, this transformative consciousness. It takes working with someone. Isn't that the body of work you do?
Yes, absolutely.
Or one piece.
Absolutely. Right. And so, yes, I've had so many teachers along my journey. It's a very long list. But Dr. Richa Nagar was one of my co-advisors, my academic co-advisors, and really one of the only reasons I stayed in academia. And she's actually brave enough to write about radical vulnerability in social justice work in academia. And, I studied with her a lot about feminist praxis. And, what does it mean if we're reading all this theory, but we're not applying it? And what does it mean if we're, kind of practicing in the world, but we're not really taking that time for reflection? Yeah. So Dr. Richa Nagar is one of my biggest mentors in the academic world. Spiritually, Gopi Kinnika, Kim Beekman, Eileen McCusick, these are all my mentors kind of in the spiritual realm. But what I've come to learn is that this work is really collaborative, right? We have to have these dialogues. We have to be able to get into the messy spaces and have these conversations with each other, right? Because that's human. That's reciprocity. That's what accountability means. That if we really want to show up being authentic, flaws and all, we have to allow space for other people to be authentic and to have brave conversations that make everyone a little uncomfortable. I really value those kind of conversations, and I really value collaborative work because even as I was mentioning with Denise earlier, right, being able to be like, okay, here's some of my, my heart on a page about how I, am kind of processing all of this. Let's kind of meet each other in our hearts and go a little bit deeper. I really think that if we're having these conversations and we're not uncomfortable, we're not really doing the work. We're just reiterating, what we already know. And when we do this collaborative, or I really come from a coalitional framework, like our identities absolutely matter in this realm. Right? Our race, our class, our gender, our sexuality, where we were born, right? Our worldviews, our kind of religious or spiritual upbringing, our training, all of these things matter, right? Because they inform how we're coming to these conversations. And, right, we also want to shift to a place where we're able to come with all of our pieces, exactly who we are, right? Share them with each other, and also work towards something beyond all of us, something beyond, right, what any individual person can see. So transformative consciousness is also really indebted to Jose Medina's work. He works a lot with Chicana feminist thought. And he uses the language of kaleidoscopic consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. And the idea that like each of us has this one unique perspective on reality, right? Or how things are. And actually, the less social power you have, the more you are able to see the true workings of power, or how these structures and infrastructures, again, whether of society, whether it's education, housing, healthcare, the criminal justice system, how they're actually impacting people. And so in dialogue, I think we often hear like, well, talking, but listening is so important. When you can right size yourself and realize that you don't know what you don't know, all you know is kind of what you've been allowed to know from this very small perspective. And when we start like putting all of our perspectives and dialogue alongside of each other, we can start to have this more three-dimensional, or I like to think 360 degree view of what's actually happening. But to do that, again, there's so much trust, and we have to meet each other in love to first try to understand before, right, we respond.
Yeah. Look, I just got a dose of this the other day, very shocking, and I'll just be brief about it. I play a sport, and I play a sport that involves, in my circle, mostly people, Asian descent, Asian Pacific, whatever it is. And I was so clueless about what they're going through right now, even to the point where when you suggest, come on, let's go out to lunch and let's go over here, they don't want to go. And I didn't really understand it. And in the end, we end up going to either a Korean restaurant. And I finally said, okay, you don't like the food I'm picking out? And they said, no. They said, you're not aware, but we are being attacked. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I consider being pretty aware, but I had no idea about these people that are in my life every day. Yeah. I had no idea. They don't talk about it. Yeah. I had no idea. So there's a different lens, that I now look at, where a group of people is so afraid for their lives and the lives of their children, they won't go to a neighborhood for fear of being attacked. And I had to really think about that, because, boy, it is a lot to take in for me, mm-hmm. who thinks I live in the safest place on the planet, mm-hmm. and to realize I don't. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Trish, thank you for today. How do we find out about you? How do we work with you? And what's your closing message would you like to leave us with today?
Yeah, thank you. Again, my practice is transformative consciousness and transformative consciousness coaching and consulting. And it's at transformativeconsciousness.com. My email is transformativeconsciousness@gmail.com. I do individual work with somatic coaching, with tuning forks. I practice biofield tuning. I do 6-week group programs, Transform, Align, and Ascend, that are really focused on just clearing out some lower density stuff and helping helping to bring people into a daily spiritual practice and kind of cultivating their individual toolbox. And then my transformative consciousness curriculum is really focused on bridging spirituality with social justice work. And again, this spring, they'll be up on my website soon. I'm going to be offering some workshops that are really kind of like Whiteness 101. And I'm moving into a place of working with people who are leaders, who want to be change makers, who are really devoted to unlearning so that they can relearn. So my work is really focused on self-healing as the gateway to collective social healing. That's why I do what I do. I really think the micro and the macro go hand in hand. We can't just do one or the other. We have to do both. And my vision is really to just get allow people to live out loud. Thank you for tuning in to Heart Change Consciousness on TransformationTalkRadio.com with me, Dr. Trish DeRocher. Make sure to come back next time so we can continue to awaken your soul purpose. Look forward to more conversations with your favorite authors, change makers, influencers, activists, and many more who practice inspired spiritual activism and transform vulnerabilities into sources of strength. For more information about me and transformative consciousness coaching, visit transformativeconsciousness.com. That's transformativeconsciousness.com. This was Heart Change Consciousness on TransformationTalkRadio.com.
Views expressed on this program are those of the host, guests, and callers, and do not necessarily reflect the views of the station, its management, or advertisers. You're listening to Transformation Talk Radio.